The girl screamed when the sheriff pulled her by the hair. The sound sliced through the dry air like a knife through bark, and for a heartbeat, the whole town went still. Even the wind stopped to listen. Elias Ward was hammering a horseshoe when it happened. The iron slipped under his hand, and the hammer rang off the anvil sharp, wrong, alive. He looked up, eyes narrowing through the drifting dust. Across the street, men were gathering by the gallows, circling something small and trembling. 3 Apache girls. Their wrists were tied with rope, ankles bleeding from the walk. The youngest couldn't have been more than 15. The tallest had blood drying on her lip, eyes dark and full of defiance. They stood barefoot on the cracked earth, while the sheriff grinned like a man showing off cattle. "Found 'em hiding near Blue Mesa," he shouted. "Army don't want 'em. Might as well make good use." Laughter rose thick, ugly, hungry. Elias set the hammer down. His palms stung from the vibration, but it wasn't the metal that hurt. It was memory, smoke, screams. A river that ran red once, long ago. He could still smell the gunpowder, hear his captain's voice yelling orders he should have refused. The faces of the dead had never left him. Now, they seemed to be looking through those 3 girls. The sheriff's whip cracked, snapping Elias back to the moment. "Ain't they something?" The tallest girl spat in his face. The crowd roared with laughter. The sheriff hit her hard across the mouth. She didn't flinch. And that, more than the blood, more than the rope, was what broke Elias Ward. He walked toward them without thinking, boots heavy on the boards, dust rising with each step. The laughter quieted when they saw his eyes. They were the kind of eyes that had seen too much killing to care about one more. He stopped beside the sheriff and said, low and cold, $2. All 3. The sheriff blinked, half amused, half incredulous. "What for?" Elias didn't answer. He pulled 2 silver coins from his pocket, placed them in the sheriff's hand, and stared at the girls. The tallest one met his gaze, breathing hard. Her lip trembled, not from fear but from rage. For a long second, no one moved. Then the sheriff shrugged. "They're yours, Ward. Hope you know what to do with them." Elias turned and started walking, slow and silent. The girls followed, still bound, under the dead stare of the crowd. Behind them, the sheriff laughed. Ahead of them, the desert waited vast, empty, merciless. Elias didn't look back. He didn't have to. He already knew what kind of hell he'd just bought himself into. The sheriff's laughter echoed behind him, fading into the dry wind. Elias walked slow, his boots crunching over the hard ground, until the sound of chains followed the 3 girls, stumbling to keep up. Their shadows stretched long under the dying Sunday. When they reached the edge of town, Elias stopped and turned. The sheriff was still on the porch, counting the coins, grinning like a man proud of his own rod. "Don't worry, Ward," he called out. "They'll bite if you let them. Savages always do." Elias didn't answer. He took out his knife and cut the ropes. The girls stepped back, free but wary, like wolves that didn't know whether to flee or fight. "You can go," Elias said quietly. "I just wanted to stop that show." "Oh." The tallest one, her name he didn't yet know, lifted her chin, defiant. "And now what? You think they'll let us leave?" Her English was rough, but her anger was sharp. She pointed at the saloon, where men still watched from the porch. Their eyes glimmered like knives. Elias looked at them, then at her. He knew she was right. Dry Hollow didn't forgive mercy. "Then we ride," he said. He untied his horse and mounted, then held a hand toward her. For a moment, she hesitated, every part of her trembling between hate and survival. Then, she took it. The younger 2 climbed behind, clinging to her waist. They rode out through the wind, past the gallows, past the graves, until the town shrank to a smudge behind them. No one spoke for miles. The sun bled into the horizon, painting their faces in gold and dust. Elias's jaw clenched. He could still hear the sheriff's words echoing in his skull. Savages always bite. Maybe they would. Maybe they should. When night came, he lit a small fire and sat apart from them. The girls huddled close together, whispering in Apache, their voices low and rhythmic, like a prayer or a curse. Elias stared into the flames. He didn't save them for kindness. He saved them because once, long ago, nobody saved him. By morning, the desert had swallowed the road behind them. Dry Hollow was gone, nothing left but wind and memory. Elias rode in silence, the reins loose in his hands, his eyes half shut against the glare. Behind him, the three girls followed on foot, wrapped in rags and dust. He'd offered to let them ride the horse. They refused. Maybe pride, maybe hate. He didn't blame them for either. The sun rose white and merciless. Every step crunched against dry stone. A vulture circled overhead, tracing slow, patient loops. When the heat grew too heavy to bear, Elias stopped near a cluster of boulders. He filled a tin cup with what little water he had and set it on the ground between them. "Drink," he said. No one moved. The oldest, tall, sharp-eyed, the one who'd spat in the sheriff's face, just stared. Her lips were cracked, her voice hoarse. "We don't drink from the same cup as killers." Elias said nothing. He took the cup, drank a mouthful himself, then poured the rest onto the sand. "Then neither of us drinks." The words surprised even him. The youngest girl flinched at the sound of his voice, as if she'd expected the man with the whip instead. When they started walking again, the wind picked up, carrying grit sharp enough to cut skin. Elias pulled his bandana over his mouth. The girls wrapped their shawls around their faces, eyes narrowing against the storm. Hours passed. The world turned the color of rust. The horizon vanished. Then, out of nowhere, one of them, the middle girl, began to hum. A low, trembling tune, barely louder than the wind. It was not a song Elias knew, but it hit him like a bullet. He'd heard something like it once, long ago, from a burning camp. The same melody, rising from the smoke. He stopped walking. "Where did you learn that?" The girl didn't answer. She just kept humming, her eyes locked on him, daring him to remember. And he did. He saw the cavalry fires, the tents collapsing, the children screaming. He saw his own hands holding the torch. He staggered a step back, breath shallow. The sandstorm howled louder, as if the desert itself was judging him. The tallest girl spoke, then her tone flat, cold. "You burned our homes." Elias's jaw tightened. "I followed orders." "Then you followed the devil." For a long time, he couldn't meet her eyes. The storm tore through them, scattering their words into the void. When it passed, the desert lay quiet again. The only sound was their breathing and the soft creak of leather as Elias lifted his canteen and handed it to her. "You lead," he said. "I'll follow." She didn't take the canteen, but this time she didn't refuse it either. They walked on under a red sky, four silhouettes lost in the vast silence, each carrying ghosts that refused to die. By the second day, the desert began to strip them down to the bone. Their clothes were stiff with dust, their lips split and bleeding. The sky burned white, without mercy. Each step felt heavier than the last. Elias walked ahead, his boots sinking into the sand, his back aching from the weight of the rifle slung across it. Behind him, the three girls trudged in silence. Sometimes they whispered to one another in their language, soft syllables carried away by the wind before he could understand. At noon, they reached a dry creek bed. The heat shimmered like smoke. Elias stopped and turned to them. "We'll rest here," he said. No one replied. The girls collapsed in the sand, their faces turned away from him. Elias knelt by a cracked rock, tapping it with his knife. No water. He tried another, then another. The sound echoed like hollow bones. From behind, a voice low, bitter cut through the silence. "You still think God listens to you?" It was the tall girl, the one whose eyes never softened. Elias didn't look up. "I stopped asking him long ago." She stood, swaying slightly from exhaustion, but her voice didn't shake. "You took from us everything he gave. You burned our rivers, our homes. You remember?" Elias set down his knife. The desert felt colder all of a sudden, even under that brutal Sunday. "I remember the orders. I remember the smoke." "And the screams?" she asked. He looked at her, then really looked. The dust on her skin, the scars across her wrist, the defiance in her stare. "Yes," he said quietly. "I remember those most of all." The middle girl, Sanny, spoke up, barely a whisper. Then why did you save us? Elias hesitated. He wanted to say I didn't. He wanted to say I was just trying to balance the scales. But the truth came out smaller, rougher, because I couldn't stand there again and do nothing. The wind rose, hissing through the rocks like a warning. Sand stung his face, sharp as glass. He stood, pulling his coat tight, and motioned to the horizon. Storm's coming. Move. I... The girls hesitated. Then, wordlessly, they followed. The sky darkened to copper. Lightning crawled over the far ridges. They pushed against the wind, stumbling through sheets of dust that cut the world into pieces. Elias kept them moving, shouting over the roar. At last, they found the half-ruined frame of a barn, its roof sagging, walls splintered by time. He waved them inside just as the sky cracked open and the desert howled. Inside, the storm beat at the walls like fists. Elias sank to his knees, chest heaving, sweat and blood mixing on his face. The girls huddled in the corner, eyes wide, watching him. For the first time since Dry Hollow, no one spoke. They just listened to the wind, to the thunder, to the silence between. The desert had tested them, stripped them bare, and somehow, all four were still standing. The storm tore through the night like a wounded beast. Rain slammed against the broken roof, slipping through the cracks in thin silver lines. The air smelled of dust, wood rot, and lightning. Elias Ward crouched near the dying fire, his hands trembling from exhaustion and cold. The girls sat huddled in the corner, wrapped in torn blankets he'd found in a wagon chest. The youngest slept fitfully, her small shoulders jerking at every thunderclap. The other two watched Elias in silence, the kind of silence that judged and waited at the same time. Elias tossed a handful of splinters into the fire. Sparks leapt and faded. He hadn't spoken since they'd entered the barn. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like a lie. When he finally looked up, the tall girl's eyes caught the firelight. Her name, he'd learned, was Nita. The other two were Tala and Sani. He'd heard them whispering the names to one another when they thought he couldn't hear. Nita's stare didn't waver. "Why are we still alive?" she asked. Elias exhaled slowly. The words came out rough. "Because I paid for you." You paid to own us?" Her tone was sharp enough to cut through the rain. "No." He poked at the fire, watching it flare. "I paid to stop it." She frowned. "Stop what?" He looked at her, eyes hollow. "The same fire I started years ago." The wind howled through the gaps in the wall, scattering ashes across the floor. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Sani Small, trembling, voice almost too soft, whispered, "You were there, weren't you? The soldiers who burned the San Carlos camp." It's... Elias's jaw clenched. His reflection flickered in the flames. "I was there." "Did you kill my mother?" Sani asked. The question hit harder than any bullet. He wanted to deny it, to tell her he couldn't have known, but the truth was too heavy to move. "I might have," he said finally. "There were orders. Names didn't matter." The fire crackled, filling the hollow between words. Tala looked at him then, not with hate, but something stranger, pity. "You followed the devil's orders," she murmured. Elias nodded once. "Ain't the first time I've heard that." Nita's hands tightened around her knees. "So what now? You think saving us makes it right?" He met her gaze. "No, but it's the first thing that didn't feel wrong." The storm beat harder against the barn, rattling the beams until dust rained down. Elias leaned back, eyes half closed, the thunder rolling like distant cannon fire. "You ever hear how the cavalry prayed before a burnin'?" he said quietly. "They'd bow their heads, say a few words to a god they didn't believe in. Then they'd ride in and make hell out of heaven. I stopped praying that night, been carrying that silence ever since." Sani crept closer to the fire, her small hands trembling. "Then maybe tonight," she said. "You listen instead." Elias blinked, confused. She motioned for him to be still. The three girls began to hum a low, haunting melody, the same tune he'd heard on the desert wind. It rose and fell with the thunder, weaving through the storm until the barn itself seemed to breathe with it. Elias sat frozen. The song wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't peace. It was something older, something that made his heart ache in places he thought long dead. When it ended, the The fire had burned down to embers. The rain softened outside, steady and calm. Nita's voice came quiet through the dark. You killed many. Elias nodded. Yes. Then you die with many ghosts. He gave a dry, broken laugh. That I do. For the first time, she looked away not out of fear, but out of weariness. Sani lay down beside her sisters. The thunder faded into the distance. Elias stayed awake, watching the last of the coals die. When the final ember went dark, he whispered to the quiet barn. If the desert still has mercy left, let it find them. I've had mine. Outside, the storm eased into rain. Inside, 4 souls rested, none of them clean, none of them saved, but all of them still breathing. Morning came slow, like an old man learning to walk again. Mist hung over the prairie, thick and silver, veiling the wrecked barn where they'd taken shelter. The air was still heavy with the scent of wet dust and smoke. Elias Ward woke before the Sunday. His back ached from the floor, his coat damp and stiff. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then the memory returned: the auction, the storm, the song. He looked toward the corner. The girls were still asleep, tangled together under a wool blanket, hair dark and matted from rain. Elias rose quietly, pushing the barn door open just enough to breathe in the morning. The land stretched before him, endless, pale, and wounded. A few crows picked at something near a puddle. In the far distance, smoke still curled from what had been the trading post. He rubbed his face with calloused hands. You keep on running, Ward, he muttered to himself. But hell keeps better pace than you ever will. He found a half-empty whiskey bottle in his saddlebag, uncorked it, and stared at the amber liquid. The reflection that looked back from it was a stranger eyes too tired for redemption. He set the bottle down. Didn't drink. Not this time. Behind him, a voice stirred the silence. You plan to leave us? Nita was awake, her tone steady but low. She was standing now, the morning light touching the bruises on her arms. I plan to move before noon, Elias said. There's a settlement a few miles north. Might find food, maybe a doctor. And then? He hesitated. Then you decide where you're going. I'll take you that far. She crossed her arms. And what if we don't trust you? He almost smiled. Then you got good sense. What The words hung between them. Outside, the sun was climbing, burning the mist into gold. He saddled his horse, tightened the straps, and checked the rifle slung by the saddle. Every motion was practiced, mechanical, the rhythm of a man who had nowhere left to be but couldn't stop moving. Sani woke next, yawning, rubbing her eyes. Is it morning? She asked softly. It's something like that, Elias said. The child smiled faintly and reached for the horse's mane, her small fingers tracing its wet hair. The horse nickered gently, the first sound of warmth since last night. They rode out before noon. The world had changed overnight. The air was clean, the sky wide and mercilessly blue. Every hoofstep sank slightly into the damp earth. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Tala broke the silence. You could have sold us back, she said quietly, or left us to die. Elias squinted at the horizon. Maybe I should have. But you didn't. He gave a slow nod. Didn't know I still had that choice in me. The trail wound between broken mesquite trees and rocks slick with rain. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily. Elias's gaze followed it, then dropped to the girls. He saw how Nita rode back straight, chin lifted, like someone who refused to break even when the world demanded it. Sani hummed softly to herself, the same tune as before. Tala watched the land, wary, her eyes sharp as flint. When they reached a ridge overlooking the valley, Elias stopped his horse. Below them, the river ran swollen with rain, glinting like molten silver. We crossed there, he said. Nita frowned. It's deep. So's everything worth reaching, he replied. They forded the river together. Water soaked their legs, cold and biting. The current tugged hard, but they made it through. On the far bank, Elias looked back, the barn now just a dark shape against the open plains. Something in him ached. Not regret exactly, but something close to it. By dusk, they found a ridge of rock that offered shelter. Elias built a small fire, careful to keep it low. As the flames flickered, the girls huddled near the warmth. For a long while, none of them spoke. Then Nita said, "You don't pray anymore, do you?" He shook his head. "Ain't sure who'd still be listening." Um, Maybe you just forgot how," she said, voice calm. "Not everyone who prays expects forgiveness." Elias stared at the fire. "Then what do they pray for?" "For morning to come," she said. He didn't answer. But later, when the others slept, Elias looked up at the stars breaking through the night sky. He whispered something that wasn't quite a prayer, but wasn't silence either. And for the first time in years, when he closed his eyes, the fire didn't follow him into sleep. By the third day, the mud had dried to dust again. The sun came back with a vengeance white, cruel, and endless. Every hoofbeat kicked up the ghosts of the land. Elias rode ahead, one hand resting on the rifle slung across his saddle. Behind him, the three girls followed close, faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats he'd traded from a peddler the night before. The silence between them wasn't hostile anymore. It was heavier, like something they all carried but didn't want to drop. They were nearing Dry Creek, a mining town squatting at the edge of nowhere. Elias had been there once before, years ago. He remembered whiskey, poker, and the sound of someone getting shot behind the saloon. He didn't remember kindness. As they descended the slope, the town came into view: half-built shacks, a leaning church steeple, and a cloud of dust that seemed permanent. A dog barked somewhere, sharp and distant. Elias slowed his horse. "Keep your heads down," he muttered, "and don't speak less I say so." Nita's eyes narrowed. "You think they'll come for us?" "I think they'll come for anyone they don't understand," he said. They rode down the main street. A few miners stared, their faces hollowed by work and whiskey. One man spat tobacco into the dirt and murmured something Elias pretended not to hear. At the far end of the street stood the Silver Ace Saloon, its paint peeling, its windows grime-streaked. A sign swung above the door, creaking in the wind. Elias tied his horse and motioned for the girls to stay outside. "Wait here, I'll get supplies." But as he stepped inside, every eye turned. The piano stopped mid-note. The bartender, a thick man with a gray beard and a missing tooth, leaned forward. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Elias Ward. Ain't thought I'd see your face again." Elias tipped his hat slightly. "Still pouring whiskey, Lyle?" "Still drinking it too." Lyle grinned, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you ran with Colonel Ross's unit. Heard you left a trail of smoke and bones." "Heard right," Elias said flatly. "But that was another lifetime. Ain't no such thing as another lifetime round here. Only debts waiting to be paid." Elias ignored him, laid a few silver coins on the counter. "Need food, blankets, a new saddle strap." Lyle's eyes flicked toward the door. "And those Apache girls outside? Yours too?" The room went dead quiet. Elias's jaw tightened. "They're under my protection." A few men at the back chuckled. One spat. "Hell, look at that. The devil's own cavalry riding with the ones he burned." The word sliced through the room. Elias turned slowly, meeting the gaze of a man in a black duster coat, long scar down his cheek, gun on his hip, the kind of smile that promised violence. "You looking to die early, friend?" Elias asked. "Just looking to remind the town what kind of man you are." The stranger sneered. "You kill women once? Now you keep 'em?" Elias didn't answer. He stepped closer, instead slow, deliberate. The man's hand twitched near his holster. Elias moved faster. A blur of motion. A crash. The barrel of Elias's revolver met the man's jaw before his gun ever cleared leather. He dropped, blood spilling into the sawdust floor. No one breathed. Elias holstered his weapon, his voice low and calm. "You boys remember me for what I've done? Fine. But remember this too: I don't run from ghosts. And I don't shoot for pleasure anymore. You push me, I finish it." He turned back to the counter. "Pack the supplies, Lyle. Now." Lyle didn't argue. When Elias stepped back outside, the girls were watching. Nita's face was unreadable, but Sonny's eyes were wide with fear. "They'll come after us," Tala whispered. "They might," Elias said, cinching the bags onto his horse. "But we ain't staying to find out." They rode out of Dry Creek before the sun set, the air behind them thick with whispers and gunpowder. The desert swallowed the town's noise until only the wind remained. As night fell, Nita finally spoke. You said you didn't shoot for pleasure. Elias's expression was stone. I don't. Then what was that? He stared ahead, eyes fixed on the dying Sunday. That was survival. And a reminder some sins don't wash off, even in the rain. And they rode on in silence, the stars blooming above them one by one. Behind them, Dry Creek faded into shadow, another scar on the map, another ghost in Elias Ward's trail. The desert swallowed everything sound, memory, and mercy. By the third night, Elias Ward could taste blood in the back of his throat, dry and metallic, like rust scraped off a forgotten gun. The wind had turned cruel again, carrying with it a storm of sand that erased the sky and blurred the horizon into a colorless void. His horse stumbled over the cracked earth, snorting with exhaustion, and the three girls trailed behind, half shadows, half ghosts. They hadn't eaten since morning. Water was almost gone. Elias's head throbbed with heat and guilt, each heartbeat echoing like a drum inside his skull. He knew they were being followed. He could feel it, the way a man feels a storm before it comes. When he stopped to check the tracks behind them, he found the proof he didn't want. 4 horses, closing in. He cursed under his breath, spat dust, and pushed forward. There was no cover for miles, no trees, no canyon, only the open wasteland and the riverbed ahead. It wasn't a river anymore, not since the drought. It was a scar of cracked clay and scattered bones. But to Elias, it was the only chance. Move, he shouted over the wind, and the girls obeyed. Nita's eyes burned through the dust, fierce and alive, while Sandy clung to Tala's hand, stumbling but refusing to fall. They reached the dry river just as the sun bled into the horizon, turning everything gold and red. The light made the world look like it was on fire again, and Elias hated how familiar it felt. He dismounted, led his horse down the embankment, and motioned for the others to stay low. We'll wait here till dark, he said, his voice hoarse. Nita frowned. And if they find us? Elias checked his rifle, chambered around. Then they find me first. He tried to smile, but it came out broken. The storm thickened, filling the air with grit, so fine it burned their eyes. He could barely see his own hand. The sound of hooves came faint and distant, then closer. Elias crouched behind a rock, his breath slow, fingers steady on the trigger. The riders appeared as black silhouettes through the wall of dust. 4 men, armed, searching. He waited. The first one came close, his shadow stretching across the sand. Elias fired once. The man fell without a sound. Chaos followed shouts, horses rearing, gunfire cutting through the storm. Elias moved fast, firing twice more, hitting another rider before a bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Pain exploded down his arm. He gritted his teeth, pressed a hand to the wound, and crawled behind cover. The world turned dim. He saw Nita running toward him through the haze, her hair whipping like black fire in the wind. Stay down, he yelled, but she didn't listen. She dropped beside him, pulled at his jacket, saw the blood soaking through. You're hit. It's nothing, he lied. They're still out there. She snatched the revolver from his holster, eyes cold as stone. Then I'll shoot. Before he could stop her, she rose just enough to aim. The flash from the muzzle lit her face. Defiant, beautiful, terrifying. A cry echoed across the riverbed, then silence. The storm swallowed the rest. When it was over, 2 of the attackers lay dead. One fled into the dust, leaving only hoofprints that vanished within minutes. Elias leaned back against the rock, his breath ragged. Nita knelt beside him, pressing cloth against his shoulder, hands trembling but steady. You're lucky, she said. The bullet went clean through. He chuckled weakly. Never been called lucky before. Maybe today's the first time. Her words were sharp, but her voice softened. She tore a strip from her skirt and tied it around his wound, the fabric quickly staining dark. You should rest, she said. We move when the moon rises. He nodded, too tired to argue. As the storm faded, the desert grew quiet again. Sandy and Tala huddled nearby, whispering prayers in a language Elias didn't know. He watched them through half-closed eyes, his body cold despite the heat. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled a storm heading south. You didn't have to come for me, he murmured. Nita glanced down, her hair falling across her face. You didn't have to save us, she replied. Neither spoke after that. The night stretched on, endless and hollow, but the silence between them felt different now, no longer made of fear, but of something raw and human. When the moon finally rose, pale and bruised, Elias forced himself to stand. His wound burned, his legs shook, yet he managed a faint smile. Let's move, he said. Nita looked at him, and for the first time since the desert began, she smiled back. It wasn't forgiveness, it was survival, and that, for now, was enough. By dawn, Elias Ward could no longer tell if the heat he felt came from the sun or the fever burning through him. The wound in his shoulder throbbed like a drumbeat, steady and merciless, and every breath dragged fire through his lungs. They had stopped in a shallow canyon where a trickle of water still ran under the rocks, barely enough to drink. The sandstorm had passed, but the silence it left behind was worse. It pressed on them from all sides, heavy and waiting. Nita watched Elias as he tried to build a fire, his hands shaking, his skin pale under the dirt. He dropped the flint twice before she moved to help. You need to rest, she said. We can't stay here, he muttered, jaw tight. They'll find the trail. You won't make it another mile, she replied. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed the fear she refused to speak. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, too weak to argue. When he finally sat down, the world tilted. The canyon spun around him, and his vision blurred. He felt her hand on his face, cool, firm, human, and then darkness swept in. He dreamed of fire, of horses screaming, of a child's cry lost in smoke. He saw his own hands covered in blood that wasn't his, and a uniform that no longer fit the man he had become. Somewhere in the dream, someone was calling his name. When he opened his eyes again, night had fallen. The stars above the canyon were cold and endless. His arm burned, wrapped in cloth damp with blood and something else, her herbs, the smell sharp and earthy. Nita sat beside the fire, grinding leaves with the edge of her knife. Sonny and Tala were asleep nearby, curled together under a blanket. Elias tried to speak, but his throat was dry. She noticed. Drink, she said, holding a tin cup to his lips. The water tasted like dust, but it was life. He drank slowly, feeling it slide down like mercy. How long? He asked. A day, she said. You were talking in your sleep. Names. A place you burned. He turned away, shame crawling up his neck. I told you I ain't worth saving. She didn't answer at first. Then she said softly, maybe not, but you're still breathing, and that counts for something. The wind moaned through the canyon, carrying the scent of distant rain. Elias stared into the fire, its glow painting the walls orange and red like an old wound reopening. You should go, he whispered. Take your sisters. They'll be safer without me. You think safety still exists for us? She said. You think there's a place in this world that wants 3 Apache girls alive? He didn't reply. He had no answer that wouldn't sound like a lie. Then you stay alive, she continued, at least until we find one. Her voice trembled only at the end, and that small crack in her strength hurt him worse than the bullet. He watched her tend the fire, every movement careful, steady, as though holding the world together with her hands. His fever worsened by midnight. He drifted in and out of sleep, haunted by ghosts that whispered through the wind. He saw faces men he'd killed, towns he'd burned, a little girl with eyes like Sanny's reaching toward him before vanishing into smoke. At one point, he woke to find Nita's hand gripping his. She was murmuring something in her language, words that sounded older than prayer. Her eyes were bright with tears she refused to shed. You're not allowed to die here, she said fiercely. Not after all that blood. He wanted to answer, but his strength failed him. He only nodded, weakly, and closed his eyes again. When morning came, the fever broke. His shirt was soaked, his body trembling, but the burning had eased. He opened his eyes to sunlight cutting through the canyon like a blade. Nita was there, half asleep, her head resting on her knees. He studied her quietly, the dust on her skin, the scars along her arm, the defiance that hadn't faded even after everything. You stayed, he said. She lifted her head, eyes half closed. I said I would. Why? Because someone has to decide when the killing stops. Her words hung in the dry air, simple and heavy. He looked away, swallowing hard. You talk like you still believe in something. I believe in dawn, she said. And you just survived one. He tried to smile but couldn't. Instead, he reached for his hat, placed it back on his head, and looked toward the rising Sunday. His body was weak, but his heart felt heavier in a different way, like a door he'd kept shut was finally beginning to open. The silence around them no longer felt like punishment. It felt like a chance. The first gunshot came at dawn. Elias Ward rose from the dying fire, hand steady on his revolver. They had found him. Sheriff Coulter's voice echoed through the canyon. You can't save them, Ward. Elias didn't answer. He stepped into the open, the wind tearing through the silence. The girls hid among the rocks as the riders came. Bullets screamed across the desert. Elias fired back, each shot slower, heavier, until only Coulter remained. The two men faced each other, both ghosts of the law they'd once believed in. You could have had your badge again, Coulter said. Ain't interested, Elias rasped. All I ever had was blood. The sheriff's shot struck him in the chest. Elias fell, the world dimming. Before Coulter could finish it, Nita rose from the dust, rifle shaking in her hands. She pulled the trigger. One shot. Coulter fell. The canyon went still. Nita ran to Elias, pressing her hands against his wound. He smiled faintly. Keep riding east. Mercy Creek. His eyes found the sunrise. Don't waste it. Then the light took him. Days later, the desert bloomed after rain. Nita placed his hat on a rock overlooking the canyon. You found your silence, Elias Ward, she whispered. Then she and the two girls rode east. Their silhouettes fading into the dawn, three survivors, carrying the memory of a man who had finally stopped running from himself. Out here in the Wild West, not every story ends with glory. Some end in dust, in silence, and in the faint memory of those who chose to stand when no one else would. Elias Ward wasn't a hero, just a man who'd seen too much blood and decided to stop spilling it. Maybe that's what redemption really means. If his story reached you, if somewhere between the gunfire and the quiet dawn you felt something, then don't let it fade away. Hit that like button, share it with someone who still believes the West had a soul, and tell me what you think down in the comments. Was Elias right to stay and fight? Or should he have kept riding east with the girls? Every story out here is a choice between running from your past or facing it head on. So, saddle up, partner. There are more tales waiting beyond the next ridge. And remember, not all legends wear a badge. Some just leave behind the sound of a final gunshot and the whisper of forgiveness on the wind.